The room is relaxed, the lights are warm, and the laughter feels effortless, until one question lands differently. In a matter of seconds, a routine late-night interview shifts tone, and what began as casual banter tightens into something far more revealing. A global superstar sits across from one of television's most seasoned hosts, and suddenly, the air between them changes. No warning, no script, just a moment that forces both men to navigate live television with millions watching. Subscribe to Prime Talk, hit like, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Because what unfolded wasn't just another celebrity appearance. It was a rare glimpse into how quickly control can slip on live TV, how a single question, carefully phrased but unexpectedly sharp, can pull a conversation into uncomfortable territory. And more importantly, how a public figure chooses to respond when the spotlight turns from promotion to pressure. Ed Sheeran had every reason to feel at ease that night. By the time he walked onto the stage, he wasn't just a chart-topping artist. He was one of the most recognizable musicians in the world. His image had long been built on authenticity. The unassuming performer with a guitar, the songwriter who turned personal stories into global hits, the celebrity who still felt approachable. Audiences trusted him. Interviewers often found him cooperative, even self-deprecating. He was, by most standards, a safe guest. Jimmy Kimmel, on the other hand, had built his reputation on something very different. As a late-night host, he balanced humor with unpredictability. His interviews could feel relaxed, but they often carried an undercurrent, an ability to pivot, to introduce topics that weren't entirely rehearsed. It was part of his appeal. Viewers tuned in not just for laughs, but for moments that felt unscripted, even slightly risky. That contrast, between Sheeran's steady, controlled persona and Kimmel's instinct for pushing boundaries, set the stage for what would follow. At first, everything moved exactly as expected. The introduction drew applause. The conversation opened with familiar ground, music, recent projects, the kind of light storytelling that keeps an audience engaged without demanding too much. Sheeran responded with ease, smiling, leaning into the rhythm of the exchange. There was nothing unusual, nothing to suggest that this interview would be remembered differently from dozens of others. But live television has its own momentum, and sometimes it only takes a subtle shift to redirect everything. The topic of lawsuits had been circulating in the background of Sheeran's career at that time. Not loudly, not constantly, but enough to exist as a quiet tension beneath his public narrative. Legal disputes in the music industry are not uncommon, but they carry weight. They raise questions about creativity, originality, and ownership, questions that don't always fit neatly into a late-night format. For a host like Kimmel, acknowledging that tension could be seen as fair game. For a guest like Sheeran, it was more complicated. Addressing it publicly meant walking a fine line, being open without saying too much, staying composed without appearing defensive. And that's where the unpredictability of live television begins to show. Because no matter how prepared a guest might be, there's always the possibility of a question arriving slightly earlier than expected, or framed in a way that feels just a bit too direct. As the conversation progressed, there was a noticeable shift, not dramatic, not immediately obvious, but enough for attentive viewers to feel it. The pacing changed. The tone sharpened, just slightly. What had been a comfortable back and forth began to carry a different kind of energy, one that hinted at something more serious beneath the surface. Kimmel, experienced as ever, knew how to navigate these transitions. He didn't rush. He didn't force the moment. Instead, he let it build naturally, allowing the audience to stay engaged without fully realizing where the conversation was heading. Sheeran, meanwhile, remained composed, but even composure can be revealing. There are moments when a guest's posture shifts, when their responses become more measured, when the ease of earlier exchanges gives way to something more deliberate. These are the subtle cues that signal a change, even before a single word confirms it. And then, almost without warning, the conversation edged closer to the subject that had been hovering just out of reach. The lawsuit. It wasn't introduced dramatically. There was no sudden interruption, no obvious confrontation. Instead, it entered the conversation in the same calm tone that had defined everything before it. But context matters, and in that moment, the context shifted everything. Because this wasn't just a casual mention. It was a pivot. For viewers at home, the transition may have felt surprising. For those in the studio, it likely registered even more clearly. The laughter softened. The attention sharpened. Everyone seemed to sense that the interview had crossed into new territory. And for Sheeran, the stakes changed instantly. How do you respond when a sensitive topic is brought up in front of a live audience? How do you maintain control of your narrative when the question isn't entirely within your control? These are the challenges that define moments like this, and they rarely come with easy answers. What made this situation particularly compelling was its subtlety. There was no raised voice, no overt conflict. But tension doesn't always need to be loud to be powerful. Sometimes it exists in pauses, in the space between words, in the way a conversation slows just enough for everyone to feel its weight. Kimmel's question, carefully timed, calmly delivered, didn't just introduce a topic. It tested a boundary. And Sheeran's reaction, whatever it would be, had to happen in real time. No edits, no second takes, just a response, shaped in the moment, under the pressure of millions of viewers. This is what makes live television so compelling and so unpredictable. It strips away the layers of preparation and reveals something closer to reality. Not perfect, not polished, but immediate. As the conversation hovered on the edge of that question, one thing became clear. This was no longer just an interview. It was a moment of decision. Would Sheeran lean into the topic, addressing it openly? Would he deflect, steering the conversation back to safer ground? Or would his response signal something else entirely, a pushback that would redefine the tone of the entire exchange? The answer unfolded in seconds, but its impact would linger far longer. And just as the question settled into the space between them, the atmosphere in the room shifted once again, this time in a way that no one could ignore. Because what happened next wasn't just unexpected. It was revealing. By the time that interview aired, the conversation around artistic ownership in the music industry had already become more visible than ever. High-profile legal battles were no longer confined to courtrooms. They had become part of mainstream discussion, analyzed by fans, media outlets, and industry professionals alike. And at the center of one of those conversations stood Ed Sheeran. His success had always been rooted in songwriting. Not just performance or image, but composition itself. From intimate acoustic beginnings to global stadium tours, his identity as an artist was built on the idea that he created something personal and original. That authenticity was a major part of his appeal. Audiences didn't just listen to his music, they trusted it. But as his influence grew, so did scrutiny. The music industry has always existed in a space where inspiration and similarity can overlap. Chord progressions repeat, melodies echo across generations, and artists often draw from shared influences. Yet when a song becomes a global hit, even subtle similarities can attract attention, and eventually, legal challenges. Sheeran found himself navigating that exact reality. At the time of his appearance with Jimmy Kimmel, one of the most widely discussed cases involved claims that his song Thinking Out Loud shared similarities with Marvin Gaye's Let's Get It On. The comparison wasn't just musical. It became part of a broader debate about creativity and ownership. Where is the line between influence and infringement? And who ultimately decides? For Sheeran, the stakes were significant. Publicly, he maintained a calm and measured tone whenever the topic surfaced. He spoke about the limited number of chord combinations in popular music and how artists inevitably build on what came before. But beneath that calm exterior, there was pressure, because these weren't just theoretical conversations. They were legal matters with real consequences. And legal matters demand caution. Every public statement carries weight. Every comment can be interpreted, analyzed, and potentially used beyond its original context. For an artist in the middle of an ongoing case, even a casual remark on a late-night show becomes something to navigate carefully. That's what made this particular interview so important. Jimmy Kimmel's show is designed to feel relaxed and conversational. It brings celebrities into a setting where they can connect with audiences in a more personal way. But that same informality can be deceptive. The questions may feel casual, but they are broadcast to millions. And sometimes, they reach deeper than expected. For Sheeran, stepping into that environment required balance. On one hand, he was there to promote and engage. On the other, he was managing a situation that required precision and restraint. In past interviews, he had shown an ability to handle difficult topics with composure. He often redirected conversations subtly, using general statements or light humor to avoid going too deep into unresolved issues. It was a skill, one that many public figures develop over time. But it's also a fragile balance, one that depends heavily on how questions are framed. And Jimmy Kimmel was known for shifting that balance. His interview style often begins with humor and familiarity, creating a sense of ease before gradually introducing more serious elements. It's not confrontational, but it can be unexpected. That unpredictability is part of what keeps audiences engaged. Because when a guest becomes comfortable, the introduction of a heavier topic can feel sharper, even if it's delivered calmly. Leading up to this appearance, there had been growing awareness around the lawsuit. Media coverage had increased, and discussions about copyright in music were becoming more frequent. For a host like Kimmel, completely avoiding the subject might have felt incomplete. But bringing it up carried its own risks. The challenge wasn't just whether to ask about it, it was how. Before the show, preparation would have played a role. Guests are usually given a general sense of what to expect, but live television always leaves room for deviation. There's no guarantee that every question will stay within expected boundaries. For Sheeran, that meant being ready, but not entirely certain. For viewers aware of the ongoing legal situation, there was an underlying anticipation. Not necessarily an expectation of conflict, but a sense that the topic existed and could surface at any moment. That subtle awareness created tension, even if it wasn't immediately visible. Sheeran remained composed, but his responses became more measured. His phrasing grew more precise, as if anticipating the possibility of a more sensitive turn in the conversation. These changes were subtle, easy to miss in real time, but significant in hindsight. A slight pause before answering. A careful choice of words. A steady but attentive posture. These are the signals that often appear just before a shift. And then there's timing. In interviews like this, timing determines everything. A question asked too early can feel abrupt. Too late, and it loses its impact. But placed at the right moment, after comfort has been established, after the audience is fully engaged, it can redefine the entire exchange. That's where this conversation was heading. Not toward confrontation, but toward a moment that couldn't be ignored. Because no matter how controlled an environment may seem, live television has a way of revealing reality. It creates moments where preparation meets unpredictability, where carefully maintained narratives are tested in real time. As the interview reached that point, the atmosphere shifted. The laughter softened. The energy narrowed. The audience remained attentive, but the tone had changed. There was a shared sense, quiet but unmistakable, that something important was about to be addressed. For Sheeran, the objective was clear: remain composed, stay within the limits required by an ongoing legal situation, and avoid saying anything that could create complications. For Kimmel, the goal was just as clear: introduce the topic in a way that felt natural, while maintaining the flow of the conversation. It's a delicate balance, one that relies on instinct as much as preparation. And in live television, instinct often takes over. As the moment approached, everything aligned: the context, the timing, the anticipation. All that remained was the question itself. And once it was asked, there would be no way to take it back. No edits, no second takes, just a response, unfolding in real time, carrying the weight of everything that had led up to it. And it began with a single, carefully delivered line. The shift happened quietly. There was no dramatic pause, no visible signal that the tone was about to change. One moment, the conversation followed its familiar rhythm, light, engaging, predictable. And the next, it didn't. Jimmy Kimmel leaned forward slightly, his posture almost unchanged, his voice steady. The delivery was calm, measured, consistent with everything that had come before. But the content of what he said carried a different weight. He brought up the lawsuit. Not abruptly, not aggressively, just directly enough that it couldn't be mistaken for anything else. For a fraction of a second, the room held its breath. Ed Sheeran's reaction wasn't immediate in words, but it was visible in everything else. His expression tightened, just slightly. The easy smile that had carried through the earlier part of the interview paused, not disappearing entirely, but settling into something more controlled. His posture shifted almost imperceptibly, shoulders adjusting as if bracing for a change in direction. It was the kind of reaction that lasts less than a second, but says everything. Kimmel continued, keeping the tone even, framing the question in a way that felt conversational rather than confrontational. But the subject itself had already altered the dynamic. This was no longer a promotional interview. It was a moment of accountability, unfolding in real time. Sheeran inhaled, subtle, but noticeable. When he responded, his voice remained calm. There was no visible frustration, no raised tone. But the ease from earlier was gone. In its place was precision. He chose his words carefully. Not just what to say, but how to say it. Each sentence felt measured, constructed with awareness. This wasn't a casual answer. it was a controlled one. The kind that acknowledges the question without fully stepping into its depth. There was a brief pause after his first response. Not long enough to break the flow, but long enough to register. Kimmel listened, nodding slightly, maintaining eye contact. For a moment, it seemed as though the conversation might move on. That the question had been asked, answered, at least on the surface, and would now give way to something lighter. But it didn't. Kimmel followed up. Again, not aggressively, but with enough clarity that the tension didn't dissolve. It sharpened. The follow-up question pressed just a little further, not demanding, but probing. It brought the topic back into focus, preventing it from fading into the background. And this time, the shift in Sheeran's demeanor became more visible. He leaned back slightly, a subtle physical reset. His expression remained composed, but the softness was gone. His eyes narrowed just a fraction, not in anger, but in concentration. In awareness. This was no longer a moment to navigate lightly. He responded again, but this time there was a difference. There was a firmness in his tone. Not confrontational, not defensive in an obvious way, but clear. Deliberate. As if drawing a boundary without explicitly stating it. His words stayed within safe ground. He didn't offer details that could complicate an ongoing legal matter. Instead, he spoke broadly, about music, about creativity, about the nature of songwriting. It was an answer designed to redirect without refusing. But the underlying message was clear. There were limits to what he was willing to discuss. Another pause followed, this one slightly longer. The audience, which had been consistently responsive earlier, grew quieter. Not silent, but noticeably restrained. Laughter was no longer part of the exchange. The energy had shifted into something more attentive, more cautious. Kimmel recognized it. He adjusted his posture, his expression softening just enough to signal a change in approach. For a brief moment, it looked like he might pivot, ease the conversation back into familiar territory. But instead, he acknowledged the tension. Not directly, not by naming it, but by allowing space for it to exist. That decision mattered. Because in live television, acknowledging a moment without overreacting to it can be just as powerful as the moment itself. Sheeran, meanwhile, held his composure. He didn't interrupt. He didn't deflect abruptly. He stayed present, engaged, but careful. Every response was filtered, not in a way that felt evasive, but in a way that reflected awareness of the stakes. There was another exchange, shorter this time. Kimmel framed it more lightly, almost as if offering an exit from the topic. A way to acknowledge what had been said without pushing further. Sheeran took it. His response was brief, controlled, and final in tone. Not dismissive, but conclusive. The kind of answer that signals a natural endpoint without needing to say so explicitly. And just like that, the moment began to pass. Kimmel transitioned the conversation. The shift was smooth, almost seamless. A return to safer topics, lighter ground. The kind of pivot that experienced hosts rely on to maintain balance. But the energy didn't immediately reset. For a few seconds, the earlier tension lingered. It was visible in the way both men adjusted, the slight recalibration of posture, the careful reintroduction of humor, the measured pacing of the next exchange. The audience followed that lead. Applause returned, but more cautiously at first. Laughter followed, but with a hint of hesitation, as if waiting for confirmation that the moment had truly passed. And gradually, it did. The conversation moved forward. The rhythm returned. The surface of the interview regained its familiar shape. But something had changed. Not dramatically. Not in a way that disrupted the entire segment. But enough. Because for those watching closely, the difference was clear. There had been a moment, brief, controlled, but undeniably real, where the boundaries of the conversation were tested. Where a question introduced tension, and a response managed it without fully dissolving it. No raised voices. No overt conflict. Just a shift. And in live television, that's often where the most revealing moments exist. Not in what is said loudly, but in what is handled carefully. As the interview continued, it carried on like any other late-night appearance. But the earlier exchange remained in the background, a reminder of how quickly the tone can change and how much can be communicated without being explicitly stated. For Sheeran, it was a demonstration of control under pressure. For Kimmel, it was a balance between curiosity and restraint. And for the audience, it was something else entirely. A glimpse behind the performance. A moment where the conversation stopped being just entertainment and became something more. Something unscripted. something real. And even as the show moved forward, that moment lingered, quietly shaping everything that came after. As the segment moved past the exchange, the shift didn't disappear, it settled. For a few seconds, the studio carried a different kind of energy. Not tense in an obvious way, not uncomfortable enough to disrupt the show, but noticeably altered. The laughter that followed the next line came a fraction later than usual. The applause felt slightly more measured. It was as if everyone in the room had registered what had just happened, even if no one addressed it directly. Jimmy Kimmel understood that rhythm. He didn't rush to fill the space, and he didn't overcorrect. Instead, he allowed the moment to breathe just enough before guiding the conversation forward. His next question leaned back into familiar territory, lighter, safer, designed to re-establish the tone without drawing attention to the shift that had just occurred. It was a controlled recovery. Not an avoidance, but a recalibration. Ed Sheeran responded in kind. His posture eased, though not completely. The relaxed demeanor from the beginning of the interview didn't fully return right away, but it softened. His answers became more fluid again, less guarded, though still precise. There was a sense that he had moved past the critical moment, but hadn't entirely forgotten it. That balance is difficult to maintain on live television, because once a conversation crosses into sensitive ground, it leaves a trace. Even when the topic changes, the awareness remains. Both participants know where the boundaries are now. Both understand what has already been tested. And yet, the show must continue. Kimmel's experience showed in how he handled the transition. He reintroduced humor gradually, not forcing it, allowing it to rebuild naturally. A light remark here, a familiar rhythm there. Small steps that brought the audience back into a more comfortable space. The audience followed. Laughter returned with more confidence. Applause regained its usual timing. The visible tension faded, not erased, but absorbed into the flow of the show. To a casual viewer, the moment might have passed quickly. Just another question, just another answer. But for those paying closer attention, it stood out, because it revealed something that carefully managed interviews rarely do. It showed how quickly control can shift, and how deliberately it has to be regained. After the segment aired, reactions didn't explode into controversy, but they didn't go unnoticed either. Clips circulated. Viewers discussed the exchange in comment sections and forums. Not in exaggerated terms, but with curiosity. People noticed the pause. They noticed the change in tone. They noticed the way Sheeran answered, and the way Kimmel followed up. It wasn't about conflict. It was about contrast. The contrast between the easygoing first half of the interview and the more measured exchange that followed. The contrast between expectation and reality. Between what audiences assume these appearances are, and what they sometimes become. Media coverage reflected that nuance. Rather than framing the moment as dramatic or confrontational, it was often described as revealing. A rare instance where a high-profile artist addressed a sensitive issue, even briefly, in an unscripted setting. A moment that highlighted the realities behind the polished surface of celebrity interviews. For Sheeran, the impact was subtle but meaningful. He didn't lose control of the narrative, but he allowed a glimpse of the pressure behind it. His response showed restraint, awareness, and a clear understanding of his position. He didn't over-explain, and he didn't deflect entirely. He acknowledged the question while maintaining the boundaries required of him. That balance reinforced something important about his public image. Not just authenticity, but composure. Because authenticity isn't always about openness. Sometimes, it's about knowing what not to say, and still appearing present, still engaging, still real. For Kimmel, the moment reflected his approach as a host. He asked the question. He followed up. But he also recognized when to step back. He didn't push the exchange into confrontation, and he didn't abandon it prematurely. He allowed it to exist in that middle space, where tension can be explored without being escalated. That's a skill built over time. And it's what allows moments like this to happen without unraveling the entire conversation. In the broader context, the exchange became part of a larger discussion about how legal and creative issues intersect with entertainment platforms. Late-night shows are designed for accessibility, for humor, for connection. But they also operate in real time, with real people navigating real situations. That intersection creates moments that feel different. Moments that aren't fully rehearsed. Moments that carry weight beyond the format they appear in. And that's why this one still matters. Not because it was loud. Not because it was dramatic. But because it was controlled. because it showed how both sides, host and guest, manage pressure in real time, how they communicate boundaries without stating them directly, how they maintain professionalism even when the conversation shifts unexpectedly. These are the moments that don't always dominate headlines, but stay with viewers, because they feel genuine, because they break, even briefly, from the predictability of the format, because they remind us that behind every carefully managed appearance, there's a real-time negotiation happening, between curiosity and caution, between openness and control. And in this case, that negotiation played out in front of millions, without edits, without second takes. Just a question, a response, and a moment that revealed more than it seemed. If you appreciate deep dives into real, unscripted television moments like this, subscribe to Prime Talk, hit like, and share your thoughts in the comments below.